Well, welcome to our next session of Elijah's story. And today we're looking at Elijah, God's champion.
Yay!
Yay. And the passage we're looking at is 1 Kings 18, verses 20 to 40, which we'll come to in a minute. But as we were just commenting now, it deals with probably what's the most well-known episode in the cycle of stories about Elijah. Is probably one of the best known Bible stories of the Old Testament.
Yeah, probably.
The people who haven't looked at the Bible since they left school probably know about it. Because it reads like something out of a boy's adventure comic. But before we get to look at the Bible passage, to say, what do we know about Baal?
Most people, if the truth be known, would be very little.
Exactly.
Very little.
Baal was a god of the Canaanites and the Phoenicians. And for most people, if they knew that much, they were going well. But our knowledge of Canaanite civilization has been absolutely transformed in the past 90 to 100 years.
Oh, okay.
Through discovery and excavation of an ancient city called Ugarit at Ras Shamra, which is, I don't know if you have your map handy, but it's on the coast way north of Sidon.
Yeah, I've got the map, I think. Here we go.
Yeah, sort of off the top end of the map.
There you go.
Yeah. Off the top end of the map, the coast of Phoenicia goes further on, and some 40 to 50 miles further up the coast was this site called Ras Shamra. It was the site of the ancient city of Ugarit. And how it was discovered was quite remarkable, because there was a peasant farmer there ploughing in his field. It wasn't good land. He regularly turned up quite substantial boulders and stones. It was a hand plough he was using. And this one day, it hit another boulder, as he thought. And the more he dug, he couldn't get to the bottom of it. And then he realized he was actually looking at the roof of a building.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So he, being a canny type, sent off for the archaeologist and hope he would get some money out of it, which he probably did. But the archaeologist moved in and discovered that what he'd hit was the roof of an old temple and library complex. And it was, there were thousands of clay tablets round about as they went through the excavation. They discovered these thousands of tablets written in this cuneiform script, which nobody knew anything about. But thanks to various scholars, it was discovered to be a new language to them, but it had characteristics of Phoenician and Old Testament Hebrew about it.
Okay.
So once they got that clue, they were able to start to decipher it. And so they found these in this sort of library that was attached to an old temple to Baal. And included in the tablets were lists of Canaanite gods, ritual, and all sorts of myths and poems about Baal. So the knowledge of Baal suddenly mushroomed for those who could read the thing. And he's the hero of many Canaanite myths, which were used to accompany and explain elaborate rituals in Canaanite religion. And most of them, you will not be surprised to know, were concerned with the fertility of the land, because that was the crucial thing for people to live. And he was represented as dying when the rains ceased and the summer sun scorched the earth. And then in these myths and legends, the Baal was depicted then as coming to life again in the autumn when the rains fell and launched the agricultural year on the annual cycle once again.
Okay.
So he was regarded as a dying and rising god. interesting.
Absolutely.
And then animal sacrifice was part of this religion, and it was accompanied by frenzied dancing and shouting, which was characteristic of the Canaanite New Year rituals, because that was designed to wake him up. Wake up, Baal.
Okay.
Together with self-laceration, bloodletting was regarded as a rite of imitative magic, really, to prompt the release of the vital rain and the life dependent on it. On occasions when the autumn rains failed and a time of drought ensued, it was thought that Baal had been offended by the people and so had withdrawn the means of life. Now, the name Baal actually means Lord, and he was worshipped by the Canaanites as the Lord of the earth and the god of weather. And you'll pick up some themes in a minute, but should be familiar. His voice was the thunder, and when he opened the windows of heaven and the sluices of the clouds, rain fell to give life to the earth. Ever so similar to God's presence in fire and cloud.
Yeah.
And I just make the point now by reading you a little bit of the translation of some of the things that were found. One passage describes Baal as he who rides upon the clouds. And another one says he will give abundance of rain, abundance of moisture with snow. He will utter his voice in the clouds and his flashings and lightnings on the earth. You may have heard those before somewhere.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Gives some sort of familiarity. Now, the picture I sent you of this, yes, I did send you the Baal image, didn't I?
You did. There we go.
There we go. The one on the left is the actual tablet that was dug up at Ugarit. And the one on the right is sort of saying what's on the left-hand side, because it's not that obvious. But basically, it depicts Baal with a thunderbolt in one hand, the right hand, and lightning in the other.
Okay.
The picture on the left-hand side also shows a little figure underneath it. It looks at first glance, until you see that it's not, it looks as if he's holding something in his hand, but that's not. It's his sword there.
Yeah.
And the little figure is meant to depict the king worshipping him.
Okay.
So it's interesting that they had this view that Baal was the mighty god, much mightier than the king, who was there as a little figure. His helmet has got the two horns on it, like horns of a bull. And these images would be found not just in this temple that they found there, but throughout the region at the high places. They weren't idols as such, but were meant to represent the god. So it's there's no suggestion that people would have bowed down and worshipped this figure, but they worshipped what he represented. So I'll shut up about Baal.
No, I mean, to be honest, Beryl, it's really interesting. It's interesting because it sets the whole story of Elijah in a spiritual context, doesn't it? I mean, you suddenly realize that actually this is about a conflict in a similar way to, to Moses in Egypt, where each of the plagues is actually about God challenging the rights of deity of the Egyptian gods.
Yeah.
I mean, every single one of them is being dismantled. And you get that feeling here as well, don't you? That suddenly you're in a situation where Elijah has been raised up at a time of great spiritual oppression and danger
Yeah.
for the children of Israel. And it's almost like God going, okay, who's the greatest? Let's just do a demonstration here. And so you get this sort of challenging of the rain, which obviously is fundamental to, you know, the confidence that people would have
Yeah.
in Baal. And then you get this, you know, this challenging of the prophets and the priests of Baal that we're looking at now. And then you get this sort of, you know, later when Elijah disappears off into the wilderness again, and you get, you know, he's not in the whisper, he's not in the thunder, he's not in the rain,
Yeah.
he's not in the, you know, God is this still small voice. And there's this sort of, there's almost a sort of compare and contrast going on, isn't there?
Yeah.
It's really interesting, and it does actually give real context to what it is we're
That's,
talking about.
yeah. Which is why I've spent some time on it. I
Yeah,
mean, Ugarit itself was finally destroyed and abandoned abruptly about 300 to 400 years earlier than the time we're looking at, probably as a result of a series of earthquakes.
okay.
But its religious practice and the literature continued to exercise such an influence upon the Canaanites and upon the Phoenicians. Now then, do you have your Bible handy?
I do.
Good. Look at Psalm 29. You got that?
Yep.
Right. Would you read from verse 3 to verse 9?
Okay, so it starts off with ascribe greatness to the Lord,
Yeah,
effectively.
leave that
And
bit. Start
yeah,
at verse 3.
yeah. So, and then it says, the voice of the Lord is over the waters, and the God of glory thunders. The Lord thunders over the mighty waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf and Sirion like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord strikes with flashes of lightning. The voice of the Lord shakes the deserts. The Lord shakes the desert of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord twists the oaks and strips the forest bare. And in his temple all cry glory. The Lord
Thank you.
sits
No,
enthroned
don't
over.
leave that. Leave the
Okay.
end bit, just to
Yep.
verse 9.
Yep.
Because those themes are all the ones that I just read came
Yes,
out
absolutely.
of the Canaanite literature.
Yep.
And what we think we have here is actually the bit that you've read is actually a Phoenician hymn,
Okay.
but then it was adapted and modified by a Hebrew poet to
It's
express his own
reappropriated.
understanding. Yeah, and that's why he's tacked on at the beginning and the end
Okay.
his own understanding and praise of God,
Okay.
not only as the Lord of history, but also as the Lord of nature.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and that's I mean that's been quite common practice over church history, hasn't it? You know, I mean,
Oh yeah,
you know, so many of the Anglican churches that are 1,000 years old are built on, you know, pagan worship sites.
yeah.
You know, it wasn't uncommon practice to reappropriate and reascribe.
So I always think about that when people are happily reading that psalm and thinking, yes, but this was a Canaanite poet originally.
Yeah.
But it's the same themes of God of thunder, the being in control of the storm and everything else.
Yes, absolutely.
So by the 9th century BC, which is Elijah's time, which we're actually looking at, there were many local variations of the Baal cult throughout Syria, Phoenicia, and former land of Canaan, including Tyre, which was where Jezebel came from, and Baal was worshipped there as with the title of Baal Melkart, which means God of the city. So it was like we would have a patron saint, a patron Baal for Tyre.
Yep.
And Uncle Jezebel's father was both king and high priest. The little figure not in the hand, but next to the image of Baal. But in addition to the general characteristics of the Canaanite Vale, Melkart was also associated with the sea and navigation, and that would have an obvious resonance for the Phoenicians. If you look back at the map, that was where their land was, along the coast.
Yep.
So he was frequently worshipped on high rocky promontories along the coast.
Yep.
Yeah. And as you come down from Sidon, coming south down the coast, and then you come to a place called Libnah, which is just inside Israelite territory. And there's a big bit that points out into the sea there.
Yep, just there. Yep.
Yeah. And that was Mount Carmel.
Okay, okay. So positionally, this encounter is, I mean, it's all a real challenge, isn't it, to the legitimacy of this deity?
Yes.
Because if he's regarded as the god of the sea as well as the god of of the land, then what a perfect place to actually go, no, you're not.
Absolutely. And then it was interesting, as we saw at the end of last study, that Elijah had told Ahab to send for the people and the prophets of Baal and Asherah to meet him at Mount Carmel, which is right in there.
Yes.
Their place.
So here's Elijah not playing at home; he's playing away.
Oh no.
Yes, he's taking the confrontation right to the heart of the enemy, really.
That's right. And of course, it was this particular bit, Melkart, because Tyre wasn't very far north of that Jezebel had introduced into Israel, bringing with her a large number of priests or Celtic prophets, whom she'd installed throughout the land in the local sanctuaries and high places, as we've seen before. Sometimes Melkart was depicted as a warrior god carrying a battle axe and wearing a helmet. And that would really have appealed to Ahab, because he was primarily a soldier.
Yeah.
He was a military man. And so, it begins to make sense why he didn't exactly kowtow to Jezebel, but he thought, oh yeah, okay, there's something in this, maybe. So, false gods. False gods in our society receive abundant attention and adoration, sometimes just for a short time. There's a sort of fad for something, but gives no answers for life's problems.
No.
So how do people sacrifice to our modern false gods? That's a rhetorical question for you to think about, because if we actually started to discuss it, we'd be here for months.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is interesting on a sort of spiritual level. It is interesting. I mean, I was talking to somebody this morning in the street, down by the church, and they were saying, that they were afraid. And I said, oh, what are you afraid of? And they said, the world is an evil place. And they found it very disconcerting. And, they were talking about the need for the reassurance that a God of good and hope and really gave them. Now, as far as I'm aware, they're not Christian, but it was a really interesting conversation. And it sort of ties into this, doesn't it? Because there's this twofold thing going on. There's this sort of physical plane political thing where you've got the partnership with Ahab and Jezebel and how politically it was expedient. And here's a warrior king adopting a warrior god, because politically he needed sort of that reassurance that, a warrior god might give. And yet you've got this sort of, and then God going, this is an affront to what is true and good and noble and real, etc., etc. And there's this inevitable conflict. And I think we see that in our own society, don't we? That there is an increasing sense of conflict between, you know, what the Bible says, for example, and what people choose to believe and do. And it is interesting. Yeah, definitely.
So after all that preamble, look, I spent some time on that because it's quite important when we look through the next bit when we
Yes, yes.
see how Elijah went about things. So I'm now going to read the passage.
Yeah.
So that's 1 Kings 18, starting at verse 20. This is after Elijah had met with Ahab. So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God." And then all the people said, "What you say is good." So they agreed to it. Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire." So they took the bull that was given to them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. "Baal, answer us," they shouted, but there was no response. No one answered, and they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened." So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it, large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a 3rd time," he ordered, and they did it the 3rd time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. Then Elijah commanded them, seize the prophets of Baal, don't let anyone get away. They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there.
Whoa.
That's definitely stuff of boy's own, isn't it?
Very much so. Very much so.
Wow. It's such a dramatic piece.
Yes.
And then numerous things to pick up on. The question as to who was the true God of Israel, entitled to the people's obedience and worship, that was the question that had to be settled beyond dispute. And it struck me again when I was reading that, when he said, you know, how long will you waver between two opinions? And isn't that a situation we find ourselves in
Absolutely.
often?
Absolutely. Yes, and it tells us something about them as well, doesn't it? It tells us that it wasn't that they'd rejected, you know, Jehovah. It was that there was almost a desire to syncretize, to bring together these two deities, and you know, so it's not that, you know, we've accepted the one and we've rejected the other. It's that we're halting between two opinions, and that's not good enough for God. That's not the way it works. And we can see that, and we can see that in our own day, and often we can see that in our own lives, where we try to mix up both the values of the world with the values of God, and it doesn't work.
And in answer to him there, the people said nothing.
Yes, yeah, which is classic, isn't it? The silent majority.
Oh, I'm not going to stick my hand up just yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Hedge your bets.
Yeah. So he went on and described how he was going to form this contest. And then we read at the end of verse 24, and all the people said, what you say is good.
Yeah.
They'd accepted the terms, if you like.
But it's interesting that Elijah stacks the bases against himself, against winning, doesn't he? Because you would have thought that he would say, you know, get 2 lambs, you know, for us to sacrifice, you know, and that he basically does something that equates to the Passover, but he doesn't. He goes, get 2 bulls, and since Baal, you know, the Baal with the bull's horns, you suddenly realize that actually he's sort of lulling them into a false sense of security on the one hand, but he's stacking the bases completely against, and it comes out with the water in the ditch, which we've already said, you know, this version of Baal was about the sea and about water and about abundance and rain, you know, and just all the way through, you think, you can almost see them going, the Lord's got no chance here. You know, I mean, right. Elijah must have a screw loose to do this.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
You're on Mount Carmel. This is where Baal lives.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So when it actually happens and the fire falls, you know, which is again a sign of, you know, of the opposing deity, it does put it completely beyond dispute, doesn't it? That there's no sort of, oh, well, you know, best out of 3.
Oh, yeah, there was none of that. It was all or nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So it really shows Elijah as God's champion here, his representative on Mount Carmel.
Yeah.
He was able to dictate the terms of the contest and proposed a trial by fire. I mean, it was so clever. You said he stacked the bases.
Yeah.
Baal was worshipped as a god of storm and lightning, i.e. fire. So what he was proposing was something that the Baal worshippers couldn't argue with. At the same time, such a challenge would appeal to the people of Israel, who'd recalled that God had revealed his presence to them at critical times in their history in fire.
Yes.
It's
But it's also interesting that he sort of subliminally, because right the way through it's the Lord, it's Jehovah. He's constantly through the whole thing reminding them of who it is that
yeah,
this is about. And it increases as the narrative goes on, doesn't it? So towards the end, where he's, it's interesting that he says, where is it? In verse 36, O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God. 37,
yeah,
answer me, O Lord, answer me, O Lord, our God, you, O Lord, our God. Then the fire of the Lord fell. And so all the way through, you've got this, you've got this sort of, this is, we're not fudging the issues here. So when they get to verse 39 and they go, the Lord, he is God, they're picking up on the refrain that Elijah has had throughout this entire conflict, this entire conquest. Yeah.
yeah. So if we think of how Elijah actually met the challenge, he spoke to the Baal worshippers in terms of their own cult. First of all, there was the preparation of the sacrificial animal. As you said, it wasn't a lamb, it was a bull. There was no spark of fire for the altar. And then he mocked them, or, he made reference, but mockingly, to their shouting to awaken Baal, who was deep in thought, busy.
Or perhaps he's traveling. I like that one.
Yeah, well, it was typical of the Phoenician cult because they were on the seaside. And the Hebrew actually adds another bit, which is always taken out of modern translations, but perhaps he was at the toilet.
Oh, yes, that's right. They don't like those things, do they? They don't like it offends the sensibilities. But yeah. Yeah,
I don't think Elijah was being bothered about that. He was just mocking.
Yeah. And it's interesting on two fronts. It's interesting because what you share in terms of sort of background and, context, suddenly you get an appreciation of what it is they're actually doing here. It isn't that they are, they're doing what they would be their normal practice. They're slashing themselves with swords, they're letting the blood flow. That in and of itself is interesting. But there's also this incredible human quality to it, isn't there? He just cannot help himself, can he? He just can't help taking the opportunity to ridicule.
Yeah. Because what they were doing, what the Baal worshippers did on Mount Carmel was to make a reproduction of the ritual pyre, which the reawakening of Melkart, Baal Melkart of Tyre, required. But despite all their efforts, the frenzied dancing, the shouting, the self-laceration, all of that, it was a disaster. The heavens remained deaf to their appeals. Fire did not come down to light the altar, and Melkart refused to wake up.
Yeah.
And he gave them a good go at it, didn't he?
Oh, yeah.
He left them to put it all together and start the ritual. And then at midday, he was saying, come on, what's happening? And it was another 3 hours before he stepped in and said, well, look, this is not happening, folks. He's not coming.
Yeah.
And then he set about his own preparations. And again, we look at the passage. Elijah was absolutely meticulous in his own preparations. First of all, he repaired the broken altar. In verse 30, they came to him and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Evidence that the people had departed from worshipping God. Then he rebuilt the altar with 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel.
And that wouldn't have been lost on the people, would it? I mean,
no.
The figurative nature of it would have been noted.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that in the divided kingdom, he doesn't go, okay, I'll just do the 10 stones or the 2 stones. It's the
Yeah.
whole of Israel that he's talking
That's
to
right.
here. Yeah.
Yeah. Because we're back to covenant in a way here.
Oh yes, yeah. Well, and that's the point of Lord being emphasized throughout, isn't it?
Yeah.
That he's constantly referring to this as the covenant keeping God, and you
Yeah.
effectively by default you have broken the covenant.
Yeah.
The onus is upon you to return, is effectively what he's doing, isn't it?
Yeah. And as you say, the 12 stones, he was indicating that he was about to offer sacrifice for the whole nation, or in the name of the whole nation. It wasn't the divided kingdom, it was the 12 tribes.
So is he, Beryl, here, when it says in verse 33, he arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces and laid it on the wood, would there have been the symbolism of the Abrahamic covenant, where he lays the parts out as you would in a covenantal act, where you get that incredible image in the Abrahamic covenant where the brazier and the flaming torch go through the middle of the pieces. Is this a covenantal act? Is he reestablishing? Right, okay, that's interesting.
How much of that would have been realized by the people in Situ? We don't know, but certainly some of them would have realized that.
Yeah.
Because he put the wood in order, he cut the bull in pieces.
Yes.
And then he drenched the altar with water to make it appear utterly impossible that fire could consume it.
Yeah.
Now here's a question. Does anything strike you about that?
I mean, the only thing that springs to mind is the fact that he does it 3 times. There's this.
He drenched it with water.
Yes.
And we're in the middle of a drought.
Oh, yes. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. Yes, in a desert area. So.
Yeah. So where did he get the water from?
Well, good question.
See, I mean, when we read this, because it's so familiar in a way, you think, oh yes, and then he rebuilt the altar, and yes, he took 12 stones to represent the tribes, and then he poured the water over it, and we get lost in the fact that, it's if, okay, there was quite a bit of time expended in rebuilding the altar and all of that. But actually, the only place the people could get water was from the sea.
Yeah.
So they would have had to have gone down Mount Carmel to the sea to fill up whatever pots they had and climb back up. It would have taken quite a time.
Yes.
And they did it 3 times. So he was demonstrating clearly that, this was not a trick.
And there is the inclusion, isn't there? There's the involvement of the people at that point. This isn't just Elijah performing for an audience. He's slowly drawing them into the covenant act in a way, isn't he? Yeah, which is very clever.
So he expended a lot of effort preparing the altar and dousing the sacrifice. And you can imagine some of the more cynical people in the crowd there thinking, he's really lost it now.
Yeah.
Okay, Baal didn't answer, but okay, busy somewhere else, we can try again. But Elijah, when he's put water on it now, 3 times, he's absolutely soaked it. And then the last thing he did in his preparations was in 36.
He prays.
He prayed.
And there's no fuss. There's, he's effectively, reminding God that he is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, effectively. But he says Israel. He's making the point again, isn't he?
Yeah.
And and let it to be known today that you are God in Israel. And but there's no fuss, there's no beating himself up, there's no crying out repetitively, there's none of that. There's this is just this, because and it's interesting, he says, doesn't he, that I am your servant, have done all these things at your command. It's that refrain of obedience that has come through in the other studies that has led him to this point where he's listening to what God has to say and just doing what he says.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And so he prayed, but it wasn't a long, involved prayer.
No.
It was brief and to the point, and prompted really by a longing for God's glory to be revealed. And he presented this in the confidence of his own faith and experience. And as you say, by calling upon God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, Elijah was declaring his faith in Yahweh as the God who'd entered into a covenant with their forefathers, never to forsake his people. And just those words reminded the people of the foundation of their hope and blessing.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no doubt about it, Elijah was appalled by the widespread apostasy of the people of Israel, who were entertaining the idea that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel had abdicated in favor of Baal. And he was profoundly stirred as he contemplated how blatantly and grievously God had been dishonored. And so the chief burden of his prayer was that God would vindicate himself that day, make known his mighty power, and turn the people's hearts back to himself, bring glory and honor to his name. And that's all the prayer was.
Yeah.
And then we come to the climax of it, because immediately lightning fell from heaven, consumed the sacrifice and the altar. So he was demonstrating here that Yahweh was the only true God, honoring Elijah's faith and settling this controversy between Yahweh and Baal. Elijah's sacrifice was accepted. And it was accepted as representative of the whole nation, the sin-laden nation, foreshadowing the greatest sacrifice of all at Calvary. It's done once and for all.
Yeah.
It's very, very powerful, this passage, and very moving.
Yes, and it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting that it's I mean, the timing. Obviously, there's a miracle of timing here, and there's a miracle of precision. That the fire doesn't burn up the onlookers, it doesn't burn up the participants, it just burns up, that in a very precise place. But it's interesting that it burns up the altar. I mean, everything's gone.
Yeah.
And you're left with bare rock, effectively, because even the soil, it has gone.
Yeah.
Everything. There's no sort of, there's nothing left, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it had to be total.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so how did the people respond?
Quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they fall prostrate, don't they? And they affirm, what Elijah's been saying, in the Lord, he is God.
Yeah, they couldn't doubt the existence and omnipotence of God any longer.
No, exactly.
So they bowed down and proclaimed their faith in him.
Yes.
The Lord, he is God. Just as the widow at Zarephath had done when her son was restored.
Yes.
And just like the declaration of the centurion at the cross. truly this was the Son of God.
Yeah, I remember Pastor Eddie in Ghana saying, that one of the things that he felt really challenged by was that in every generation, in every age, there has to be an affirmation, an authentication of God as being God. Because when people lose touch with the immediacy of God's presence, they very quickly slide into, to a lack of Christian standard, a lack of Christian value, etc., etc. And you can see it here. Suddenly God is real, isn't he? God is alive. God is present, and you've got to do something about that. I was reading something this week about the resurrection, and evidence for the resurrection, and basically this guy was saying, the minute you allow for the legitimacy of resurrection, people don't want to do that. They want to deny resurrection, because the minute you allow for it, you've got to admit that God is real and that Jesus is alive, and you've got to do something about it. And there's an element of that in here, isn't it? Suddenly they've got to do something about it. They can't mess about anymore.
Yeah, they can't fudge it.
No.
It's there in front of their eyes.
Yeah.
In a dramatic way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, in our day, verse 40 would be problematic for some people. This whole concept of, get the 450 prophets and don't allow any to escape, and he slaughtered them. This is one of those sort of areas where people say, oh, well, the God of the Old Testament isn't the same as the God of the New Testament, because the God of the New Testament is a God of love, and the Old Testament is a God of vengeance. What would you say to that, Beryl?
Well, first of all, he's a God of judgment, and judgment had to come. I return to that next time, because there'll be a bit of an overlap next time.
Yeah. But of course, when we say judgment, we're talking about justice, aren't we? We're not talking about vengeance.
That's right.
We're talking about justice.
Yeah. But in the same way that the fire had been all consuming, and taken the altar, everything, the soil, the whole thing, Elijah needed to make sure that these prophets that the cult was dealt with. It was gone. It was, well, perhaps it wasn't, but at this point.
So there's an issue of purity here. And there's an issue. when they enter the promised land, and God says to Joshua, don't marry, don't intermingle with the Canaanites who are in the land, and they completely ignored it and were led astray. There's an element of that here as well, isn't there? This purging, this purification is about not being led astray again.
That's right. So you get rid of what's likely to lead you astray.
And again, that's something that we're not very good at doing in our day and generation. It's
get a bit wishy-washy, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. We think. It's like you meet people who are marrying non-Christians, and I know this is controversial in a way, but they think that by marrying them, they might eventually save them.
Yeah. It doesn't work.
Very rarely works that way, and if you manage to maintain your own faith, and I'm not denying that many do, it stilts that faith, because you've lashed yourself to something other than, and it's true in many areas of life, isn't it? It isn't just that one. It's true wherever you compromise, you restrict, you dilute and diminish. And we all do it.
After they made their declaration, the Lord, he is God, and then Elijah tells them, seize the prophets of Baal, don't let anyone get away. And they seized them. Why were they so willing to comply, do you think?
Oh, good question. I'm not entirely
But-
sure that if I'd just seen God lick up all of that, I'd not comply, to be honest with you.
Well, yeah, but I mean, as a general point, there's nothing more potent at stirring up the anger of people and a
Oh,
crowd
yes, yes.
than the realization that they've been lied to for
Yes,
years.
yes, yes. And there's failure, isn't there, here as well? Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yes, we've been duped.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
And how,
of course, verse 40 is the bit that makes Jezebel hopping mad, doesn't she? I mean, you know, quite
yes,
apart from anything else, this is going to cause Elijah a lot of problems.
yeah. And I'm going to disappoint you because we're not even getting to Jezebel next time. But
Okay, yeah, yeah,
this
yeah,
is
yeah.
more or less, but will I say there'll be an overlap because we start at this point next time. But it was,
Yes, and I can understand that because what comes next is actually it is as equally important as what has just taken place.
yeah,
You know, and it would be remiss not to actually spend a bit of time on that. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. So that really wraps that up
Yeah,
for today's session.
fantastic. Well, thank you. That's really helpful and as illuminated considerably. I mean, you're right. The preamble was quite long, but essential to a greater understanding and appreciation of what actually Elijah's doing here.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
it's extraordinary.
picking out bits of their cult all the way through.
Yeah, yeah. But you can also recognize and we'll see further next time, but why Elijah is exhausted at the end of this.
Yeah,
Because it's drained. I mean, what he does here, it always reminds me a bit of Athanasius. All the world's against you, Athanasius. Then it's Athanasius against the world, and that feeling of so often in church history, it does feel like it's the lone voice that turns the tables. Martin Luther,
yeah,
here I stand, I can do no other.
yeah,
And there is something emotionally hugely draining about this. It's almost exhausting to read it.
I was just going to say it's emotionally draining actually looking at it.
Yeah, absolutely.
'Cause,
Yeah. 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 And then when we realize what Elijah does next, it's that's extraordinary as well. But hey, that's for another time.
yeah.
Thank you so much. No, that's really good. Really
Okay.
good. Yeah, bless you. And we'll meet again next week.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Elijah, the man of faith, I think is the title for next week.
Okay. So he's not the man of faith right at this moment. He's the champion, but yeah,
He's
that's
got
interesting.